Wednesday, October 30th, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, campus mental health is in crisis. Michigan State University's surveys and suicide rates are prompting rising concern about the well-being of its students. Our reporter has dug into that data and talked to advocates hoping to turn that tide, and he's here to talk to us all today. So, Anish, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is a great story that you wrote, tackling a tough topic, and you were able to get into both kind of the details of the problem, but also a little bit more of a hopeful view from some of these people that are really interested in actually kind of solving it. So I thought, yeah, you could come on today. But, the rest of this conversation where we're talking about mental health this, mental health that, I want to be more specific about that term because I think sometimes we throw it around without explaining it. Can you tell me, when you talk about surveys and whatnot indicating like poor mental health of students, what does that actually mean? What are the specific kind of like issues and conditions that they're like diagnosing with this term, of student mental health when they give that metric?
Yeah, one thing to actually go off of here with like the actual survey I'm basing this off of is the National College Health Assessment. It's not just mental health, it's all kinds of health. But with this story, I wanted to focus mainly on mental health because those are the things that when I actually heard about this from an ASMSU GA meeting, the director of University Health and Wellbeing, Alexis Travis, actually gave a presentation about her division because it's fairly new. And that was mainly what I wanted to focus on because the numbers here were the most alarming. They kind of stood out to me.
I see. So this is part of a broader survey.
Yeah, part of a broader survey. But
what are the survey questions specifically about mental health that prompted these concerns?
Well, mainly they focus on, it's not just like, I guess, poor mental health. It's more so like when they ask you questions like some of the data was like, have you experienced anxiety in the last year or so? It's more so like students can say that because, they have experienced anxiety. It's not a sense of like, do you have poor anxiety? But another data point that goes more into it is that, let's say with it, it's like, have you actually been diagnosed or treated with overwhelming anxiety? So that's more so like a more specific question of it in terms of like students, they just experience it. They don't necessarily go for treatment. They just experience it. And then this random survey that I believe is like around 900 or so students randomly selected. That's who's picked. And then it's not just students who are being treated. It's also students who are being affected with anxiety, and they personally believe so. So
both people who sort of self-diagnose, who believe they're experiencing anxiety, and people who are actually like diagnosed by a doctor and have like had a diagnosis of anxiety.
Yeah, and I believe the number here is that 29% has affected academic performance. So it's like, and also with that, 74% of MSU students have been diagnosed. So that's the diagnosis number. It's anxiety and also, I believe, stress as well. But either diagnosed or
74% have been diagnosed
or treated. Yes.
Wow.
That's the 2024 National College Health Assessment, I believe.
And you said how many are feel that it's affected their academic work?
That was 29%.
So almost a third.
Yeah, to go off of that, this is, I'm not certain if it is actually diagnosed and treated or if it's just they believe they have anxiety, but in the last year, moderate to high stress has been cited as 72% by students. So that's a pretty significant number, and I feel like one question that I didn't really go delve into because it was just a survey, it's just numbers. They didn't really, you can't really, I guess, base off of a student. You can't define what they believe is moderate to high stress because moderate to high stress, it's just like, for you or me, that could be one thing. For another person, that could be a totally different thing because like workloads vary from student to student. And with that, it's more so the idea of like, this is a survey, and then actually when students go into these university programs, like mental health and trauma support services, like CAPS Connect, all these kinds of mental health services, it's a totally different conversation because you actually have professionals talking to them.
And so how do those numbers, because in a vacuum, that sounds pretty alarming, right? I mean, if you have 70-some% of students that have actually been diagnosed with anxiety and whatnot or been treated for it, but how do those numbers compare like to recent years? Is this sort of the norm at MSU, or is this an increasing problem?
I would say it's sort of a thing like the kind of tone I've based off of what I got from all these directors I spoke with is that this is a thing that has been occurring consistently, and it's not just a university problem. It is a problem that's been occurring across all demographics, I guess. That's one thing that I spoke with about an expert. Like, this is a problem that just not only affects campus students, but the idea of like that they described is that this is a microcosm. We're in a microcosm of a country. Like, a college campus is a microcosm of all kinds of voices, all kinds of demographics, people, and it's just, we're seeing that reflected in a lot more heightened and intensified version of it because we're in a college campus. We're so close to people, we see all these kinds of voices, all these kinds of issues that are occurring on a national level, occur at a campus-wide level too, I guess.
And then also, on sort of the most extreme end of things, you also got into sort of the suicide rates in recent years on MSU's campus. And those are, I mean, tell me about that. You said that they're increasing, but we don't know exactly how.
So what happened is that one of the main things that Dr. Alexis Travis spoke about at this ASMSU GA meeting, just informational, was that suicide rates, they've been measuring them since 2020, and they've measured them for the last 4 years, 2024 being the last year. They've been increasing all 4 years, but for the last 2 years, they've peaked. And I guess that means they peaked this year as well. But with that, they've kind of come to this consensus that, okay, well, this is something we need to deal with, this is something we need to actually work on. And I believe with this, it was the University Health and Wellbeing Division under this umbrella. They have all these sorts of, I think it's 11 different pillars, or 11 different programs, or 11 different kind of groupings of campus mental health services. And with the Mental Health and Trauma Support Services Division, I believe, they recently elected a new director, Lee Norwood. And that was kind of one of the reasons for her being elected, was to head this sort of suicide mortality committee that's being worked on with Ingham County.
Because there has been such a high rate in recent years of suicide.
I believe she was elected, or she was actually appointed a few weeks ago, but she's been kind of involved with other universities in the past. So she hasn't been an MSU specific person, but she finally joined MSU because she said she worked on other universities on mental health services, but not at MSU. So now she's kind of this voice that is, I guess, a voice for university mental health, but is helping out with this committee and also just helping out with our Mental Health and Trauma Support Services Division.
Well, I think that's interesting. I want to get more into that work with, the things that MSU is trying to do to kind of turn the tide on this problem. But first, can you tell me a little bit about, you talked to some experts, internally and externally, people even outside of MSU, who told you about just kind of theorizing on why this is happening. What is unique about this moment, maybe this demographic that's causing this kind of high rate of mental health issues? Tell me about that. I mean, what's causing this?
Yeah, for sure. So I believe is actually an associate professor who works mainly in pediatric psychology, but she also talks to young adults, college students. She focuses on all sorts of student health. And one of the main things is she kind of laid it out. It's hard to answer because it's more so an idea of it's always affecting people, and it's always affecting people in so many different aspects of their life. It's individual, biological, relational, societal, community, and I believe political levels. It's all these sorts of factors loading on you. When she described it as this, imagine you're a student and you have these large-scale natural and man-made disasters that are affecting you, I guess, either directly or just they're in the back of your head. You have civil unrest both on and off campus. We've obviously had a lot of unrest in terms of divestment, in terms of just conversations regarding students are not very happy with the administration. They're not very happy.
There's definitely a lack of institutional trust at MSU. I mean, even going back to Nassar and then more recently, that's definitely, I hadn't thought about that as connected with student mental health, but not sort of having an institutional grounding.
Yeah, it's you don't really feel safe at your school. You don't really feel like your school respects you in a sense where they don't really treat your voice as an important input in this conversation, because we are paying money to be here. We are paying to be here, and we should feel like they respect us as well. And that's kind of a factor in terms of not just civil unrest, but it's students, not every group feels safe on campus too.
Yeah.
It's, I can go into that a bit later, but also off those other points, it's legal infringements of our bodily autonomy. We have an election coming up with that. People don't feel safe. People feel like their lives are literally on the ballot, their autonomy is on the ballot currently, and that's another factor. But all of these kinds of things kind of pile up, I guess. And she described it as a cognitive load. So with cognitive load, it's more or less a thing that's a background stress in your life. You have all these things that you're dealing with. You have, whether it's political issues, you have civil unrest, you have all these things that don't affect you necessarily on a day-to-day level, but these are issues that affect you in a sense where you're thinking about them. You're putting mental energy into those topics, and whether it's something as drastic as an election where your bodily autonomy is on the ballot, or it's just civil unrest in terms of there's divestment protests, there's ideas of things you don't agree with that the university is doing, or just or you're part of a marginalized community where things are happening to your community on campus. Maybe there are hate incidents or just things that you don't agree with, and that's the thing that doesn't affect you personally, but is the thing that affects you mentally. And when you're going day to day on classes, you can't really perform 100% academically because of the fact that these are things that are affecting your mental space. And that's just one thing that Dr. Crystal Caderne talked about, is that cognitive load is just, it's one of the main things that affects students, because we have to use our brains mentally to perform academically. And when we can't perform academically 100%, it affects their other mental factors, and it kind of just builds up, and it's
Yeah.
this volume is like the volume gauge is just turning up and up and up, and you can't really focus on other things.
Well, and that's fascinating because, when you hear about student mental health, I think especially in like sort of uninformed conversations about it, what I expect to hear when I hear like student mental health is bad is people are isolated because of the pandemic. They're on their phones too much on social media and whatnot. And this feels much more existential and political, what you're hearing from this expert. Is that pandemic, cell phone, social media, kind of those tropes, that sort of isolation? Is that a myth? Is that a factor that is like a confounding variable here where it complicates this? How does that play in?
I wouldn't say so. I would say absolutely it does play a factor. Like social isolation is very much a thing that was cited by both this expert and also the directors on campus. Like social isolation is a factor, but it's more so, I imagine in a sense where like it's more so a fact that like they don't go out of their way to interact with these resources. Social isolation is there, but it's just one thing that is, they use this wording of that like we don't really know, we can't really determine how the effects, the reverberations of the pandemic affect us until like years later. We're still studying that, and that's one thing they couldn't go too much into because they honestly don't know.
It's maybe less understood than some of these other factors you're talking about.
These are factors that have existed for, I don't know, as long as like a civilization has, like political and the rest, like it's always a thing that's going to be occurring.
But this unique situation of the pandemic and social media isn't as well understood.
It isn't, but it's just like, and it is a sense of like too where like it's just one of those cognitive loads. It's one of those background stressors. But at the same time, with those background stressors, like they affect other things too. Once the volume's turned up, they affect your relationships. They affect your community engagement. They affect all these sorts of other factors that build on top of that. And I guess with relationships, that does play a factor into social isolation.
Well, and I think this is interesting too because what you've talked about thus far, none of this is really MSU stuff. I mean, maybe that institutional betrayal is uniquely bad at MSU just because you have these compounding things of you have students that are very divided on this divestment issue. You have students that are, divided on these kind of broader issues of sexual violence that MSU continues to struggle with since Larry Nassar. But I mean, trusted institutions, I think we know is in question kind of everywhere. That's not even really unique to MSU. So what are these kind of campus leaders that you talk to here at the university doing to combat these more kind of existential national problems that the problems aren't necessarily in their control? Are there solutions they feel like are at their disposal to help students navigate that?
The solutions, the main solution that they've always gone back to is outreach. Outreach is just the main thing they talk about. It's either holding events, like they mentioned like they held an event recently that was just kind of more of like a mental health fair in a sense where it's just bring people together on campus to either just have like a more like social event and then like on top of that like accentuate that with speakers and also have people have screeners and just talk about their own mental health. But the thing is just outreach is the main issue. Like that's what they've always been working on and that's what they've always been trying to, I guess, tackle. And with outreach, it's more a sense of like, so 2 years ago, to kind of go in a segue here with the University Health and Wellbeing Division, before that occurred, like all of these like mental health services were kind of disconnected. Like CAPS was disconnected, mental health and trauma support services, that was all disconnected. So imagine all these mental health services are disconnected, they can't communicate with each other in an efficient manner. And 2 years ago, they kind of, I guess they restructured. And now there's an umbrella term with 11 pillars. University Health and Wellbeing is the main, like, is like the pillar.
I mean, because this is, as I understand it, a new department where they took a bunch of stuff that was housed in other places and put it together under Alexis Travis, under this new leadership. I mean, that feels significant to me, right? That, I mean, am I understanding you right? That this is like, they've created kind of a new centralization where this is like one office, not a bunch of little mental health resources spread across existing things at MSU.
And the main reason for that was to just integrate services, to have communication where it's like, let's say a student doesn't really know what they're looking for, and then that way it's so easily communicatable. You can just communicate from one office to another, and it's not a matter of like students just looking around. It's a lot easier for students to actually find what they need, like find the help they need with an integrated system like the University Health and Wellbeing.
A student
Division.
can go to University of Health and Wellbeing, and under that umbrella, there are a bunch of different services, and they can kind of direct you to what's a good fit. Is that sort of the thinking?
Well, I wouldn't say there's like it's not like an office students can walk into. It's just more, they describe it as a division. It's not a department, it's just a division. But with that, it's like, I guess it's more so that like, with what I said before, like the CAPS director and the mental health and trauma support services director, they work together on this like on this suicide rates committee. But it's a thing where like they're working together. They're communicating with each other. It's a matter of communication more so than just a student like going into a simple building, a University Health and Wellbeing building, because I don't believe that exists. It's just a division in a sense where it's more of like an organizational, administrational thing.
Yeah, it's not something maybe a student would physically see represented.
No.
What about, though, under this umbrella with all this communication, I mean, what are they communicating about? Tell me about a couple of the services that they're offering to students that they say are going to help, people with this crisis.
Do you mean services like in terms of like university services?
Like a thing a student could access from the university.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing they were discussing is that a new program that CAPS is doing, they do workshops all the time, all throughout the semester.
Yeah.
And CAPS, one thing that's brand new, I believe, is that's occurring currently right now is the Stop, Breathe, Check-In program. That's mainly to deal with stress. Like one thing they always talk about is they want to destigmatize stress. They want to destigmatize anxiety. And then this program is more so a workshop that students can sign up for and go to discuss stress and kind of learn about that through CAPS. And if you, with other programs, like there's also like a CAPS Connect program, which is, I believe it's a lot shorter. It's just kind of like a in and out, like you don't have to go continually. It's not like with CAPS, it's like you have to sign up for that. You're assigned like an instructor, you're assigned like not instructor, you're assigned like a counselor, I guess. But with CAPS Connect, it's more so you just go in and out. Like if you have a problem, you go there, very like short term, I guess.
Yeah.
But in terms of other services, it's more so, it's not really they're introducing new services. It's just a sense of like the way these services like work together is a lot different now. It's like they're all interconnected in the sense that they're not operating at their own individual capacities and like individual silos is what the word she used. They're operating in a sense where it's like they're working together, they're like communicating like, okay, how do we do this? Like when they have issues and then they're working on issues like improving suicide rates and like mental health services, like they communicate to solve these issues. It's not just a sense of like they're working independently, they're working together, I guess. So
what about, is there kind of like any sort of like finish line or check-in point where they will do a similar assessment again? I mean, this survey that you talked about, does it happen on a regular basis where there's a time people can revisit and say, is what MSU is doing working? Is this getting better?
Yeah, it happens every 2 years, I believe, at MSU. And currently on their website, I haven't been able to access that 2024 data. Like I have data, like specific bullet points from Alexis Travis, but in terms of like an actual conclusive, the full survey, it's not accessible online.
But then, I guess presumably in 2026, there'll be another one of these surveys, and we might see if kind of the tide has changed.
Yeah, for example, like the one on the website currently right now I assume it doesn't update because it's been so recent, is the 2022 one. You can read through the whole thing. It's around like 100 pages, and it doesn't cover just mental health. Like I said before, it covers any and all aspects of student health.
Yeah. Well, I'll be excited to see in 2026 what progress they've made. Hopefully, you won't be here. I think you'll have just graduated when that comes out. Sadly, but a new, hungry young reporter like Anish will be all over it. Maybe on the 1909.
Hope so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on the show. It's great to have you. That's all for now, but we'll be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. Until then, Anish's story that we talked about and all of his coverage of student affairs, ASMSU, student government, clubs, advocacy, you could find that on statenews.com. Thank you to my guest, Anish, again, for coming on, our podcast coordinator, Taylor. And most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.